All right, buckle up for this one. We're going deep on the case of Lloyd Gomez.
Lloyd Gomez.
Yeah, also known as like the Phantom Hobo Killer, or sometimes they called him the Hobo Jungle Killer.
Oh, wow. Okay, yeah. I'm familiar.
This guy, he wasn't just your average serial killer. I mean, the details of his crimes, this is like 1950s California. It gets pretty dark.
Right.
And the thing is, there are echoes of his own past that make this one, well, it's uniquely disturbing.
I can imagine. So where are we getting all this info from? What are we diving into?
We're going to be looking at excerpts from his Wikipedia article. Should be a pretty good overview of the case.
Sounds good.
What really gets me about Gomez is how his life, well, it almost reads like a textbook example of what criminologists call the cycle of violence.
Oh, interesting.
Like, born in 1923, loses his mother at a young age, experiences homelessness. It's like right from the start, he's dealt a tough hand, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, those are what we call adverse childhood experiences. Unfortunately, they're a common thread in the backgrounds of, well, a lot of violent offenders.
Right.
It's not an excuse, of course, but I think understanding that background really helps us grasp just how complex these cases can be.
Totally, totally. And things, I mean, they escalated pretty quickly with him, right?
Yeah.
He was convicted of assault with a knife when he was only 19 years old.
Yeah, so at that point, he's already displaying a propensity for violence, and it went beyond just that one incident, too. He served time later for dodging the draft during World War II.
Okay, so we're seeing a pattern here.
Oh, yeah. And get this, he also accosted a 10-year-old boy.
What?
At knife point. Stole his rifle.
No way.
Yeah.
So, yeah, okay, that paints a pretty clear picture of aggression, like a blatant disregard for the law. And then, between 1950 and 1951, well, that's when the murders start.
The murders?
9 transient men. Killed in some really brutal ways. I'm talking shooting, bludgeoning. He even crushed some of their skulls with rocks.
It's horrific. But what's interesting to me is that even with all the brutality, there are these, well, elements that point to something more calculated going on than just pure rage. Like, Gomez robbed a lot of his victims. That suggests there was at least some degree of premeditation involved. It wasn't just like he was lashing out. There was some planning.
It's wild to think about because he actually confessed later to being disappointed that he only got away with like $62.26 from all 9 victims.
Yeah, that's a really strange detail.
Makes you wonder, right? Like, was money really the main driving force behind all of this? Or were there, I don't know, were there some darker psychological needs that he was satisfying through these acts?
Well, that's the million-dollar question with a case like this, isn't it? And then on top of all that, we have this other bizarre detail, right? He takes a 7.5-month break right in the middle of this killing spree.
Wait, hold on. He just stops.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah. So what was he doing during that time? Like, was it remorse? Did he have some kind of change of heart? Or was it just like a pause before the storm picked back up?
It's impossible to know for sure, but it adds another layer to the mystery of, what was motivating him.
Yeah, that break is definitely a real head-scratcher. Almost as strange as how he ended up getting caught.
How was that?
It's a petty theft charge. Just a petty theft charge. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, he confesses to everything. He even led the authorities to one of the crime scenes.
It sounds like he wanted to get caught.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? Was it, I don't know, maybe some genuine desire to, like, unburden himself? Or was there some twisted sense of pride in what he did? Or could it have been like a calculated attempt to manipulate the legal system, hoping they'd think he was insane or something? Who knows?
Yeah, it's impossible to say for sure, but that's one of the many questions that must have haunted everyone involved in the case.
Once he was in custody, the focus shifted to the murder of Warren Cunningham. That was his second victim. Any idea why they zeroed in on that one in particular?
Well, this is where the legal strategy gets pretty interesting. They had an eyewitness to Cunningham's murder.
An eyewitness? Really?
Even though this witness was blind in one eye.
Wow.
That gave the prosecution a stronger case, which was really important, especially because they were seeking the death penalty.
So it was the eyewitness that made this particular case stand out. What about Gomez's defense team? Did they try to use an insanity plea?
Actually, no. Their strategy focused on trying to move the trial out of Sacramento.
Why?
Well, they argued that all the media frenzy surrounding the case would make it impossible for him to get a fair trial, find an impartial jury. But the judge didn't buy it.
He rejected the request.
Yep.
So no insanity plea. Interesting.
Well, they didn't go that route. But there's another interesting thing. 3 mental health specialists were appointed to evaluate Gomez.
So to determine his mental state when you committed the crimes, I mean, could he even, like, form the intent to kill? Is that what premeditation really
We
means?
got it. Premeditation is a legal term. It refers to the planning and the intent behind a crime. So basically, the specialists were looking for, I don't know, any signs of mental illness, something that might have affected his capacity for premeditation, because that would have big implications for his sentencing.
I can imagine.
It's a very complex area of law, and a lot hinges on exactly how sanity is defined and how it's evaluated.
It's crazy because on top of everything else, he actually tried to escape during one of the hearings.
What? No.
He saw an unlocked door and just bolted. A guard tackled him before he got too far, but still.
Wow. That speaks to, I don't know, maybe a level of impulsivity, maybe even a lack of, fully grasping how serious his situation was.
Even when he's facing the death penalty, he still wants to run.
Yeah.
That's desperation. Okay, so what happened next? Was he convicted?
The jury found him guilty. In the end, despite the defense's arguments, the psychological evaluations, the whole 9 yards, he was sentenced to death.
What a tragic ending to a really tragic story. But there's another piece to this whole thing, right? A connection to his family history that just adds another layer of questions to the whole thing.
Oh, yeah. And it's a chilling one. Remember earlier when we were talking about the whole cycle of violence thing and the impact of, those early life experiences?
Right.
Well, it turns out that Gomez's father, his name was Manuel Gomez, was also a convicted murderer.
Are you serious? His father, too. What happened there?
Just a few years before Lloyd started his killing spree, Manuel was convicted of beating a man to death.
Oh, my God.
With a pick handle.
A pick handle?
Yeah. He was sentenced to life in prison, and he actually died there just a few months after Lloyd's execution.
That's just, I mean, that's unbelievably eerie. A father and son, both convicted murderers, both dying in prison. I mean, you can't help but wonder if there's some kind of genetic component to this kind of violence.
That's a question that, it haunts this case. Did Lloyd inherit some predisposition towards violence? Or was it the environment he grew up in? Witnessing his father's horrific act, did that plant a seed for his own crime?
Right. Or was it some horrifying combination of both, like nature and nurture both gone tragically wrong?
It's hard to say.
Yeah.
It really is.
It really is. It makes you think, like, how much of who we are is already, set in stone? How much is actually shaped by what happens to us?
It's the age-old question, right? Nature versus nurture. Cases like this, they really bring that debate to the forefront. Criminologists, psychologists, they're constantly wrestling with these ideas, trying to figure out what role genetics play, what role environment plays, and how individual choice fits into it all.
And with Lloyd, it's not just him, right? It's that his dad died in prison, too, just a few months after he did. Talk about a strange coincidence.
Yeah, it's almost like something out of Shakespeare. The sins of the father and all that. It's like this echo of violence reverberating through generations.
So after Lloyd's sentenced to death, what happens? Did he appeal?
He's sent to San Quentin. That was notorious for being California's death row back then. And he did. He planned to appeal initially, but ultimately he decided against it.
Why? Wouldn't you fight for your life? That's your last chance.
Well, it's a real psychological puzzle. The day before his execution, he gave an interview, and he seemed, surprisingly calm, resigned to his fate. He even said he didn't want to see a chaplain, said he didn't believe in religion, just like his father. It's like he had made peace with it all, maybe even felt some relief that it was finally over.
It's so sad and confusing to be that young and just ready to die. I can't even imagine what must have been going through his head.
There's this account, I read it somewhere, that his last words were to a prison guard. Just said, "I don't want to live anymore."
Wow. Heavy stuff. Whatever he did, you have to feel a little sad for a life that just went so wrong, a life that ended like that. It's just bleak.
Yeah, it's a reminder that even in the darkest stories, there's a human element. We can condemn the actions for sure, but we also have to try to understand the person behind them. Because maybe in that understanding, we can find ways to prevent these tragedies from happening again.
I think you're right. It's easy to get lost in the sensationalism of it all. But at the end of the day, it's about real people, real consequences. We can't forget that.
Exactly. And I think beyond just the individual tragedy, cases like this force us to look at, bigger societal issues. Remember, Gomez was targeting transient men, people living on the margins of society, the kind of people who are easily forgotten.
Yeah, the homeless population. They're easy targets, right? They didn't have support systems. Nobody really noticed if they disappeared.
Exactly. And that says a lot about the lack of, social safety nets, back then especially. It was a problem then, and unfortunately it still is in a lot of ways. It really makes you think about our responsibility to the most vulnerable people in our society, the ones who are often overlooked.
And then there's this whole other issue of mental health. I mean, was Lloyd Gomez actually insane? Or was he a product of a system that failed him? A guy who never really had a shot at a normal life?
These are the questions that stick with you, aren't they? And they challenge us to really think critically about how we as a society, how we deal with things like poverty, homelessness, mental illness. Because these are complex problems. They're all tangled up together, and they can lead to so much suffering. And they can create environments where crime can thrive.
It's like a vicious cycle. Poverty and lack of opportunity can lead to despair. And sometimes that despair, it comes out as violence. And without proper mental health services, people who are struggling, they may not get the help they need, not before it's too late.
Yeah, exactly. It's all connected. It's tempting to just label someone like Lord Gomez a monster. But the truth is, monsters, they're often made. They aren't born that way. They're shaped by their circumstances, by systems that fail them, and by the choices they make within those limitations.
That's a pretty sobering thought, but an important one, right?
Yeah.
We can't just focus on the individual. We got to look at the bigger picture.
Yeah.
All the things in society that contribute to these awful events.
I agree. And that's what's so powerful about, deep dives like this. It's not just about the facts of the case. It's about understanding the context, the motivations, the ripple effects. It's about asking tough questions and grappling with uncomfortable truths.
So for you listening, as we get to the end of this deep dive, I want to leave you with something to think about. Do you think it was all inevitable for Lloyd? Did his rough upbringing and his father's history, did that seal his fate? Or were there other factors at play? Things hidden in his personality, his experiences, things that maybe pushed him down this dark path? It's a question without an easy answer, but it's one worth considering.
Because the more we understand about cases like this, the better equipped we are to deal with the root causes of violence and all the suffering that comes with it.
Yeah, no shortage of things to think about with this case, that's for sure. We've covered his crimes, we've talked about what might have been going on in his head, and then there's that crazy parallel with his father. It's all pretty heavy.
It is, it is. But I think it's good to keep in mind that even though Gomez's story is, well, it's pretty unique, there are parts of it that also, reflect these big problems in society back then and even today.
Like what we were talking about before, the lack of support for people, the fact that the homeless population is so vulnerable, and of course the stigma around mental illness.
Exactly. I mean, think about it. Gomez preyed on transient men, people who were living, well, they were basically invisible, on the edges of society. Nobody really kept track of them. Nobody would notice if they went missing.
And that made them easy targets.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a sign that people didn't really care, that the system was failing to protect the people who needed it most.
And that's not just a problem in the 1950s, right? We still have huge issues with homelessness and with making sure people have access to mental health care, even today.
Definitely. And even though we've come a long way in some areas, there's still so much work to do. The fact that there are people out there falling through the cracks, people struggling with poverty and mental illness and addiction, people who aren't getting the help they need, well, it's a pretty stark reminder that we've got a long way to go.
Yeah, it's a tough pill to swallow. So I guess the question is, what can we learn from a case like this? Is it just like a warning sign, a reminder of how bad things can get?
I think it's more than that. I mean, yeah, it shows us the dark side of human nature, but it makes us want to do something. By digging into the details of cases like this, looking at how people make choices, how society plays a role, all the psychological stuff, we can start to understand the root causes of violence better.
And if we understand it better, maybe we can actually prevent it.
Exactly. If we know what the risk factors are, if we know where the system is failing, all those societal blind spots, maybe we can actually create a world where these terrible things are less likely to happen.
So maybe Lloyd Gomez's story, as awful as it is, can be something we can learn from.
I think so. It forces us to look at the hard truths about who we are, about the world we live in, and about how we treat each other. It makes us want to be better, to have more compassion, to be more aware, and to actually do something about the problems that lead to violence.
Wow. This whole deep dive, it's really been quite a journey. We've seen some pretty dark stuff, but we've also talked about how we can understand things better, how we can grow from this, maybe even build a better society because of it.
Yeah, and I think that's the most important thing to take away from all of this. We can't pretend the darkness isn't there, but we can't let it control us either. We have to use it to make positive change, to try and create a world where stories like Lloyd Gomez's are just a distant memory.
Thanks for being here and exploring all this with us. Keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep on diving deep.